Latino street musician arrested for disturbance. His jail performance becomes phenomenon and changes city policy. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. The bustling streets of the city come to a standstill as a single guitar echoes through the air. His fingers tremble, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. Carlos, a humble street musician, wasn't just playing for the passersby. No, this was different. This was his lifeline, his only hope to provide for his unborn child. But in the blink of an eye, everything changes. Suddenly, police sirens cut through the melody, and within moments, Carlos is dragged away in handcuffs. Accused of disturbing the peace, he watches helplessly as his world crumbles. The same music that once brought joy to strangers has now thrown him into a nightmare. Alone, behind bars, with no way to reach his pregnant wife, Carlos faces an unimaginable reality. But what happens next will leave an entire city in shock. What begins as a simple arrest spirals into something much bigger, something no one could have predicted. How did this musician's quiet, soulful performance ignite a movement that would change everything? You won't believe how this story unfolds. The crisp autumn air carried the melancholic strains of a guitar through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. As the evening sun cast long shadows between towering skyscrapers, Carlos Mendoza's fingers danced across the strings of his battered instrument, coaxing out a haunting melody that seemed to touch the very soul of the city. At 28, Carlos was a picture of quiet determination. His weathered hands, calloused from years of playing, moved with a grace that belied the hardships etched into his face. Dark eyes, filled with a mix of passion and worry, scanned the small crowd that had gathered around him in Daly Plaza. For Carlos, this wasn't just about the few dollars tossed into his open guitar case. Each note he played was a lifeline, a desperate attempt to keep his pregnant wife, Maria, and their unborn child afloat in a sea of mounting bills and dwindling hope. Their tiny apartment in Pilsen, with its leaky faucets and drafty windows, was a far cry from the American dream they'd imagined when they'd left Mexico City 2 years ago. As Carlos launched into a soulful rendition of Hallelujah, the world around him seemed to fade away. A young woman in a crisp business suit stopped mid-stride, her eyes welling with tears as the music washed over her. An elderly man leaned heavily on his cane, nodding in time with the rhythm, a wistful smile playing across his wrinkled features. For a brief, beautiful moment, the disparate threads of humanity in the plaza were woven together by Carlos's music. A homeless man, huddled nearby, found himself humming along, his troubles momentarily forgotten. Even the pigeons seemed to coo in harmony, adding their voices to the impromptu chorus. But the spell was abruptly shattered as 2 security guards from the adjacent office building marched purposefully towards Carlos. Their faces were masks of stern disapproval, a stark contrast to the expressions of those around them. "Hey you, time to pack it up," the taller guard barked, his voice cutting through the final notes of the song. "You're disturbing the peace." Carlos's fingers stilled on the strings, confusion and dismay evident in his eyes. "Please, senor," he pleaded, his accent thickening with nervousness. "Just a few more minutes. I'm almost finished for the day." The guard's partner, a stocky man with a buzz cut, stepped forward menacingly. "You heard him. Move along or we'll have to call the cops." The crowd began to murmur, some voicing their objections to the guard's heavy-handed approach. The homeless man, who had been enjoying the music, struggled to his feet, his voice raspy but determined. "Leave him be. He ain't hurting nobody." Carlos, sensing the growing tension, began to pack up his guitar. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to defuse the situation. "I don't want any trouble." But as he reached for his guitar case, the stocky guard roughly shoved the homeless man, sending him stumbling backwards. Without thinking, Carlos stepped between them, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Please, there's no need for—" His words were cut short as the guard grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the concrete planter. "That's it. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace and interfering with security personnel." The plaza erupted into chaos. Bystanders shouted in protest, phones were raised to capture the unfolding injustice, and Carlos found himself being roughly handcuffed, his precious guitar clattering to the ground. As a police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, Carlos caught sight of Maria pushing through the crowd, her eyes wide with fear and her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. "Carlos!" she cried out, reaching for him as the officers dragged him towards the waiting vehicle. "Maria, I'm sorry," Carlos called back, his voice breaking. "Call Tio Jorge, he'll help you." The last thing Carlos saw before being shoved into the back of the police car was his beloved guitar lying abandoned on the sidewalk, a poignant symbol of dreams deferred and music silenced. As the door slammed shut, a single tear rolled down his cheek, mirroring the stunned silence that had fallen over the plaza. In the crowd, the young businesswoman who had been moved to tears by Carlos's music now stood frozen in disbelief, her own eyes glistening. The elderly man shook his head sadly, muttering about how things never really change. And the homeless man, still reeling from the guard's push, picked up Carlos's guitar with trembling hands, cradling it like a wounded bird. As the police car pulled away, its siren cutting through the evening air, the gathered onlookers were left with a sense of helpless outrage. They had witnessed more than just an arrest. They had seen the brutal silencing of art, of hope, of the human spirit itself. Little did anyone know that this moment of injustice would be the catalyst for a movement that would sweep through the city, challenging long-held prejudices and forcing a reckoning with the very nature of public space and artistic expression. For Carlos, locked in the back of the police car and watching the city lights blur past, the future had never seemed more uncertain. His fingers, now bound behind his back, ached for the comfort of his guitar strings. In the silence of his confinement, he began to hum softly, a quiet act of defiance against the forces that sought to silence him. As the police car disappeared around a corner, the first whispers of outrage began to spread through social media. Shaky cell phone videos of the arrest were already being uploaded, shared, and commented on. The hashtag #ChankFreeCarlos the musician began to trend locally, the first ripples of what would soon become a tidal wave of public opinion. Back in the plaza, Maria collapsed into the arms of a kind stranger, her sobs echoing in the space where, just moments before, her husband's music had filled the air with beauty and hope. The homeless man, still clutching Carlos's guitar, began to strum a clumsy but heartfelt version of Amazing Grace, a tribute to the fallen musician and a reminder to all that the spirit of art and resistance could not be so easily silenced. As night fell over Chicago, the story of Carlos Mendoza, the street musician arrested for daring to bring joy to a concrete jungle, began to spread like wildfire. It was a story that would challenge the conscience of a city, spark a debate about the role of art in public spaces, and ultimately change the lives of countless individuals caught in the gears of an often uncaring system. But for now, Carlos sat alone in a cold holding cell, his music silenced, his future uncertain, unaware that his arrest was about to become the opening note in a symphony of change that would resonate far beyond the streets of Chicago. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Cook County Jail buzzed incessantly, casting an sickly glow over Carlos Mendoza's face as he sat on the edge of a hard metal bunk. The cacophony of slamming doors, shouted orders, and muffled sobs created a discordant symphony that grated against his musician's ears. This was a far cry from the melodies he'd been crafting in Daly Plaza just hours before. Carlos's fingers twitched involuntarily, yearning for the familiar feel of guitar strings. The absence of his instrument left an almost physical ache in his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the music in his mind, but the chaotic sounds of the jail drowned out even his inner voice. "Hey, maestro!" A gruff voice cut through his thoughts. Carlos looked up to see a heavily tattooed man leering at him from the next cell. "What's a pretty boy like you in for? Didn't tip your valet?" Before Carlos could respond, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes spoke up from the corner of the crowded holding cell. "Leave him be, Razor. Saw it on the news. He's that street musician they busted for no good reason." A murmur rippled through the cell. Carlos felt the weight of curious and skeptical gazes upon him. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse from stress and dehydration. I was just playing my guitar. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." An older man with graying hair and kind eyes nodded sympathetically. "Ain't that always the way? System's got no place for beauty. Name's Frank. What's yours, son?" "Carlos," he replied, grateful for the small kindness. "Carlos Mendoza." As the night wore on, Carlos found himself sharing his story with his cellmates. Many of them, he discovered, were there for similarly minor infractions: loitering, unpaid parking tickets, mistaken identity. Their tales of injustice and bureaucratic indifference wove together into a tapestry of urban struggle that both comforted and distressed Carlos. But even as he found a modicum of solidarity with his fellow inmates, Carlos's thoughts kept drifting to Maria. The image of her tear-stained face as he was driven away haunted him. She was due to give birth in just a few weeks, and they had been counting on his busking money to cover the last of the medical bills. "Your first night's always the hardest," Frank said softly, noticing Carlos's distant gaze. "Try to get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's visitation day. Maybe your family can come see you." Carlos nodded gratefully, but sleep seemed an impossible luxury. As he lay on the uncomfortable bunk, staring at the ceiling, he began to hum softly to himself. It was a lullaby his mother used to sing, a gentle melody that had always soothed him in times of trouble. Gradually, the cacophony of the jail seemed to dim. Other inmates fell silent, listening to the quiet song. For a brief moment, the harsh reality of their surroundings faded, replaced by a shared sense of peace and nostalgia. "Hey!" a guard's sharp voice shattered the moment. "Knock off that noise! Lights out means silence!" The spell broken, Carlos fell into an uneasy sleep, his dreams a chaotic mix of music and silence, freedom and confinement. Morning brought a flurry of activity as inmates were processed, released, or transferred. Carlos found himself herded into a larger cell block, the reality of his situation sinking in with each clanging gate. As he stood in line for a meager breakfast, Carlos overheard snatches of conversation that made his heart race. Other inmates were talking about protests outside the jail, about a viral video of his arrest. He desperately wanted to know more, but fear of drawing attention to himself kept him silent. Later that morning, Carlos was led to the visitation area. His heart leapt when he saw Maria on the other side of the glass, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. They pressed their hands against the partition, so close yet impossibly far apart. "Mi amor," Maria's voice crackled through the phone. "Are you okay? Have they hurt you?" Carlos forced a smile. "I'm fine, cariño. Don't worry about me. How are you? The baby?" Maria's other hand rested protectively on her swollen belly. "We're managing. Tio Jorge is helping and—" "Carlos, you wouldn't believe what's happening outside. Your arrest. It's all over the news. People are angry. They're demanding your release. There are musicians playing in front of the jail right now." Carlos felt a mix of hope and trepidation. "Maria, I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to come home to you and our baby." "I know, mi vida. But this is bigger than us now. You've become a symbol." Maria's voice broke. "We'll get you out of here, I promise." As their time came to an end, Carlos and Maria exchanged words of love and reassurance. But as he was led back to his cell, a gnawing worry took root in Carlos's heart. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a cause. He was just a man who wanted to make music and provide for his family. That afternoon, a guard approached Carlos. "Mendoza, you've got a visitor. Some hotshot lawyer wanting to take your case pro bono." Confused but hopeful, Carlos followed the guard to a small meeting room. A sharply dressed woman with steely eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor waited for him. "Mr. Mendoza," she began as soon as he sat down, "my name is Sarah Goldstein. I've been following your case, and I believe we have a strong argument for your immediate release and possible civil action against the city." Carlos's head spun as the lawyer laid out a strategy involving First Amendment rights, excessive force, and racial profiling. It all seemed so big, so far removed from his simple desire to play music and return to his family. "Ms. Goldstein," he interrupted softly. "I appreciate your help, truly, but I'm not looking to fight the entire system. I just want to go home to my wife." The lawyer's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Mendoza, I understand. But sometimes justice for one person can lead to justice for many. Your case has the potential to change things for street performers, for immigrants, for anyone who's been unfairly targeted by overzealous law enforcement." As Carlos weighed her words, a commotion could be heard from outside. The faint strains of guitar music drifted through the walls, accompanied by chants of "Free Carlos." The lawyer smiled. "Hear that? That's the sound of change. Will you let me help you be a part of it?" Carlos closed his eyes, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve in his gaze. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do this. For Maria, for our baby, and for everyone out there who just wants to make the world a little more beautiful." As Carlos was led back to his cell, the distant music seemed to grow louder, a promise of hope in a place where silence had reigned. He began to hum along, no longer afraid of who might hear. In that moment, Carlos realized that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply to keep singing, no matter how dark the night. The days in Cook County Jail blurred together for Carlos, each one a monotonous cycle of bland meals, mind-numbing boredom, and gnawing worry about Maria and their unborn child. But on the 7th night of his incarceration, something unexpected happened that would change everything. It was just after lights out when Officer Mike Donovan, a veteran guard with kind eyes that belied his gruff exterior, approached Carlos's cell. "Mendoza," he whispered, glancing furtively down the corridor. "Got something for you." Carlos sat up on his bunk, curiosity piqued. Officer Donovan reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a battered acoustic guitar. "It ain't much," he said, passing it through the bars. "My kid's old one. Thought you might want to give the boys a little concert." Carlos's hands trembled as he took the instrument, feeling the familiar weight and texture of the strings beneath his fingers. "Gracias," he breathed, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But why?" Donovan shrugged, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "My old man was a jazz player in the 60s. Music's in my blood. Plus, this place could use some beauty." He jerked his thumb towards the cell block. "Just keep it down, all right? Don't want the captain on my ass." As the guard's footsteps faded away, Carlos cradled the guitar like a long-lost friend. He began to strum softly, his fingers remembering the chords, even as his mind struggled to believe this moment was real. The first notes of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" drifted through the cell block, barely audible at first. But as Carlos gained confidence, his playing grew stronger, his rich voice joining the melody in a whisper that seemed to caress the very air. One by one, the other inmates fell silent, straining to hear the unexpected serenade. Hardened men who hadn't shed a tear in years found themselves misty-eyed, transported by the music to happier times and places far beyond these concrete walls. In a nearby cell, an elderly inmate named Joe, serving time for a decades-old crime he swore he didn't commit, closed his rheumy eyes and saw his long-dead wife smiling at him across a sunlit meadow. 2 cells down, a young gang member named Tyrell felt the weight of his choices lift, if only for a moment, as he remembered his mother singing him to sleep as a child. As Carlos segged into a heartfelt rendition of "Stand By Me," something remarkable happened. Voices began to join his, tentative at first, then growing in strength and numbers. The harmonies were rough, unpracticed, but filled with raw emotion that transcended any imperfections. For those precious minutes, the jail was transformed. Race, crime, and background ceased to matter. There were no guards or inmates, just human beings united by the universal language of music. Unbeknownst to Carlos and the other prisoners, a young night shift worker named Emily was capturing the impromptu concert on her phone. With tears in her eyes, she uploaded the video to social media, adding the caption, "This is what injustice sounds like. Free Carlos the musician." As the final notes faded away, A profound silence fell over the cell block. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice called out, "Encore, maestro!" Laughter and applause erupted, quickly stifled as the inmates remembered their surroundings. But the mood had irrevocably shifted. Where there had been tension and despair, now there was a fragile sense of hope and camaraderie. Carlos played late into the night, taking requests and sharing stories between songs. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like himself again. Not a symbol or a cause, but simply a musician with the power to touch hearts and lift spirits. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the high, barred windows, Carlos finally set the guitar aside. His fingers were sore, his voice hoarse, but his soul felt lighter than it had in days. "Hey, Carlos," called out Frank from a few cells down. "Thanks, man, that was something special." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the block. Carlos smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "De nada," he replied softly. "Music is meant to be shared." What Carlos didn't know was that at that very moment, Emily's video was going viral. As commuters checked their phones on their way to work, as morning news shows scrambled for content, the story of the jailed street musician and his jailhouse serenade was spreading like wildfire. By the time Carlos was led to the visitation area later that morning, the world outside had changed. Maria's face was radiant with excitement as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Carlos, mi amor, have you heard? Your music? It's everywhere. People are demanding your release. There are protests planned. Even the mayor has made a statement." Carlos blinked, struggling to process this information. But how? As Maria filled him in on the viral video and the public outcry, Carlos felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Relief that his case was gaining attention, hope that he might soon be reunited with his wife, but also a hint of trepidation at being thrust into the spotlight. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria's eyes shone with determination. "Now, mi vida, we fight. Your lawyer thinks she can get you out on bail soon, and once you're free—" She paused, a mischievous smile playing at her lips. "Well, I think Chicago is ready to hear your music again. On every street corner if necessary." As their time came to an end, Carlos pressed his hand against the glass, wishing he could hold Maria close. "Te amo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and the baby, you're my everything." "Te amo también," Maria replied. "Stay strong, Carlos. Your music has started something beautiful. Now it's time for the world to hear your voice." As Carlos was led back to his cell, he felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness churning in his gut. He had never sought fame or wanted to be a catalyst for change. He was just a man who loved music and his family. But as he passed by the other inmates, many of whom nodded at him with newfound respect, Carlos realized that sometimes life thrust greatness upon the most unlikely of people. And when it did, the only thing to do was to play on, letting the music lead the way to whatever lay ahead. Back in his cell, Carlos picked up the borrowed guitar once more. As his fingers found the strings, he began to compose a new song, one of hope, of justice, and of the unbreakable human spirit. Outside the jail walls, unbeknownst to him, a movement was growing, fueled by the power of his music and the undeniable truth that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to lift your voice in song. As the autumn sun rose over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city's iconic skyline, an entirely different kind of dawn was breaking in the digital realm. The video of Carlos's jailhouse performance, captured by Emily's shaky smartphone camera, had exploded overnight. It ricocheted across social media platforms, each share accompanied by impassioned comments and calls for justice. By mid-morning, Antioquia Free Carlos, the musician, was trending nationwide. Local news stations scrambled to cover the story, their vans crowding the street outside Cook County Jail. CNN and MSNBC picked it up, framing Carlos's arrest as part of a larger narrative about civil liberties and the criminalization of poverty. Inside his cell, Carlos remained oblivious to the firestorm he had inadvertently ignited. His world had shrunk to the confines of his cell block, his borrowed guitar, and his growing worry for Maria and their unborn child. As he strummed quietly, working on the song he'd begun composing the night before, he had no idea that millions of people across the country were sharing his music and his story. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Pilsen, Maria sat surrounded by a growing group of supporters. Community organizers, local musicians, and even a few celebrity advocates had rallied around her cause. The tiny living room buzzed with activity as they planned protests, media appearances, and legal strategies. "Maria, look at this!" exclaimed Rosa, a young activist from the neighborhood, holding up her phone. "Lin-Manuel Miranda just tweeted about Carlos. He's calling for a benefit concert." Maria's eyes widened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her face. "It's incredible," she said softly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "But all I want is for Carlos to come home." As the morning wore on, the first protests began to form outside the jail. What started as a small group of local musicians and activists quickly swelled as people from all walks of life joined in. They carried signs reading, "Music is not a crime," and "Let Carlos play." The air filled with the strains of guitars, harmonicas, and drums as impromptu jam sessions broke out. Inside the jail, the atmosphere was tense. Guards whispered among themselves, casting uneasy glances at Carlos as they passed his cell. The other inmates, sensing something momentous was happening, peppered Carlos with questions he couldn't answer. It was nearly noon when Officer Donovan appeared at Carlos's cell, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Mendoza," he said gruffly. "You've got a visitor, some hotshot lawyer and, well, you'll see." Confused and apprehensive, Carlos followed Donovan to the visitation area. His heart leapt when he saw Maria waiting for him, her face radiant despite the clear exhaustion in her eyes. But it was the man standing next to her that made Carlos's jaw drop. "Mr. Mendoza," said the tall, distinguished-looking man, extending his hand through the small opening in the partition. "I'm Congressman John Lewis. I've been following your case, and I believe a great injustice has been done here." Carlos shook the congressman's hand in a daze, struggling to process what was happening. As Lewis began to outline the steps he was taking to secure Carlos's release, Maria leaned in close to the glass. "Mi amor," she whispered, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and fierce determination. "You won't believe what's happening out there. The whole city, the whole country is talking about you, about us." As Maria filled Carlos in on the viral spread of his story and the growing movement outside, his emotions warred within him. Pride at the impact his music had made battled with a deep-seated fear of the spotlight and the weight of suddenly being cast as a symbol for a cause much larger than himself. I don't know if I can be what they want me to be," Carlos admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a musician, Maria, not a hero or an activist." Maria pressed her hand against the glass, as if trying to reach through and touch him. "You're you, Carlos. That's all you need to be. Your music. It speaks to people's hearts. That's more powerful than any protest or political speech." As their visit came to an end, Congressman Lewis made a solemn promise to Carlos. "We're going to get you out of here, son, and when we do, I want you to come to Washington. Your story needs to be heard by those in power." Carlos nodded, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. As he was led back to his cell, the muffled sounds of the protest outside grew louder. For the first time, he could make out the chants clearly. "Free Carlos! Let the music play!" Back in his cell, Carlos picked up the guitar with trembling hands. The weight of expectation felt heavier than ever, but as his fingers found the strings, a calm settled over him. He began to play, pouring all his conflicted emotions into the music. As the melody drifted through the cell block, Carlos closed his eyes and allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine a future beyond these walls. A future where his music could be a force for change, where he could provide for his family and make a difference in the world. Outside, unbeknownst to Carlos, his impromptu concert was being live-streamed by one of the guards, adding fuel to the already raging fire of public opinion. As millions watched and listened, the barriers between prisoner and public, between one man's struggle and a nation's conscience, began to blur. In that moment, as Carlos's music bridged the gap between his cell and the world beyond, the first true notes of revolution were struck. The song of justice, once begun, would not be easily silenced. As the sun dipped below Chicago's skyline, casting long shadows across the city, the fervor surrounding Carlos's case showed no signs of abating. Outside Cook County Jail, the crowd of protesters had swelled to thousands, their chants and music creating a cacophony that penetrated even the thickest prison walls. Inside his cell, Carlos sat on the edge of his bunk, the borrowed guitar resting in his lap. His fingers absently plucked at the strings as he tried to process the whirlwind of events that had transpired over the past few days. The voice of his cellmate, Frank, cut through his reverie. "Hey, Carlos," Frank called out softly. "There's something you should know, something I overheard the guards talking about." Carlos looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, amigo?" Frank hesitated, glancing nervously down the corridor before continuing in a hushed tone. "It's about the security chief who had you arrested. Guy named Robert Hawkins. Turns out he's got some skeletons in his closet, man. Big ones." As Frank related the whispered conversation he'd overheard, Carlos felt the blood drain from his face. Robert Hawkins, the man responsible for his arrest and separation from Maria, was harboring a dark secret that struck at the very heart of Carlos's own story. According to the guards' gossip, Hawkins had been involved in a hit-and-run accident years ago, an accident that had claimed the life of a young Latino musician. In a cruel twist of fate, that musician had been Carlos's own cousin, Miguel, who had inspired Carlos to pursue music in the first place. The revelation hit Carlos like a physical blow. He remembered the pain of losing Miguel, the family's grief, and the frustration of knowing the perpetrator had never been brought to justice. And now, to learn that the very man responsible for his current predicament was also connected to that long-ago tragedy, it was almost too much to bear. As the shock began to wear off, a maelstrom of emotions swept through Carlos. Anger, grief, and a burning desire for justice warred within him. His fingers tightened around the neck of the guitar, knuckles turning white with the strain of conflicting impulses. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked, concern etched on his weathered face. Carlos closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to center himself. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve in his gaze. I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I can't let this go. For Miguel, for my family, for justice." Just then, Officer Donovan appeared at the cell door. "Mendoza," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Your lawyer's here. Says it's urgent." As Carlos was led to the visitation area, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd learned. He found Sarah Goldstein waiting for him, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "Carlos," she began as soon as he sat down, "we've had a major breakthrough. The judge has agreed to review your case immediately. There's a good chance you could be released on bail as early as tomorrow morning." Under normal circumstances, this news would have filled Carlos with unbridled joy. But now, with the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on him, he felt conflicted. "Ms. Goldstein," he said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you, something that might change everything." As Carlos related the story of Miguel's death and Robert Hawkins' alleged involvement, Sarah's expression shifted from shock to grim determination. This changes things," she admitted. "We could use this information to not only secure your release, but to bring Hawkins to justice." "But Carlos," she paused, fixing him with an intense gaze, "you need to understand the implications. Going public with this could be dangerous. Hawkins is a powerful man with connections. Are you sure you want to?" Carlos fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. On one hand, the chance for justice for Miguel was tantalizing. On the other, he thought of Maria, of their unborn child, of the life they had dreamed of building together. Was it worth risking everything for vengeance? As if summoned by his thoughts, Maria appeared in the doorway, escorted by another guard. Her eyes widened as she took in Carlos's troubled expression. "Mi amor," she said softly, moving to sit beside him. What's wrong?" With a heavy heart, Carlos recounted the revelation about Hawkins and Miguel. As he spoke, he watched a range of emotions play across Maria's face: shock, anger, and finally, a deep sadness. "Oh, Carlos," she whispered, taking his hand in hers. "I'm so sorry. What do you want to do?" Carlos looked from Maria to Sarah, feeling the weight of his decision like a physical presence in the room. I need to think," he said finally. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about Miguel, about justice, about the kind of world we want our child to grow up in." As the visit came to an end, Carlos was led back to his cell, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The borrowed guitar sat waiting for him, and almost without thinking, he picked it up and began to play. The melody that flowed from his fingers was unlike anything he had ever created before. It was a lament for Miguel, a cry for justice, and a prayer for guidance, all rolled into one. As the music filled the cell block, Carlos felt a clarity begin to settle over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever path he chose, his music would light the way. And as the last notes faded away, Carlos made a silent vow to honor Miguel's memory, protect his family, and use his unexpected platform to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Outside the jail, the protesters continued their vigil, unaware of the new complexity that had been added to Carlos's story. As night fell over Chicago, the city held its breath, waiting to see what the dawn would bring for the musician, whose simple act of playing on a street corner had sparked a movement and unearthed long-buried secrets. The pre-dawn hours in Cook County Jail were usually marked by an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional clanging of metal doors or the muffled sobs of new inmates. But on this particular morning, an unusual energy crackled through the air. Word had spread quickly about Carlos's impending bail hearing, and the entire cell block seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. Carlos hadn't slept a wink. He sat on his bunk, the borrowed guitar cradled in his lap, his fingers absently plucking out a melancholy tune. The revelation about Robert Hawkins and his cousin Miguel's death weighed heavily on his mind, competing with thoughts of Maria, their unborn child, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the high, barred windows, Officer Donovan appeared at Carlos's cell. "It's time, Mendoza," he said, his gruff voice tinged with an emotion Carlos couldn't quite place. Was it sympathy? Respect? The walk to the courthouse felt surreal. Carlos, handcuffed and flanked by guards, could hear the growing roar of the crowd outside. As they approached the back entrance, he caught glimpses of signs, banners, and faces both familiar and strange, all united in their support for him. Inside the courtroom, Carlos's heart leapt at the sight of Maria, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and worry. Beside her sat Sarah Goldstein, looking sharp and determined in her crisp suit. On the other side of the aisle, Carlos was shocked to see Robert Hawkins himself, looking decidedly uncomfortable as he conferred with his own legal team. As the hearing began, Sarah presented a compelling case for Carlos's release, citing the peaceful nature of his music, the public outcry, and the questionable circumstances of his arrest. The prosecution, seeming almost half-hearted in their arguments, didn't put up much of a fight. Then came the moment Carlos had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Sarah, with a quick glance at Carlos for confirmation, brought up the allegations against Robert Hawkins. A hush fell over the courtroom as Sarah detailed the hit-and-run accident that had claimed Miguel's life years ago and Hawkins' alleged involvement. Carlos watched as the color drained from Hawkins' face, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and fear. As Sarah concluded her statement, the judge called for a brief recess. Carlos found himself being led to a small conference room, where Maria immediately enveloped him in a tight embrace. "Oh, Carlos," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. But are you sure about this? Going after Hawkins like this, it could be dangerous." Carlos pulled back slightly, looking into Maria's eyes. "I don't know if it's the right thing, mi amor," he admitted, "but I know I can't stay silent. For Miguel, for us, for our baby." Just then, There was a knock at the door. Sarah entered, her face a mask of professional calm. "Carlos, Maria," she said, "Robert Hawkins has requested to speak with you privately. It's highly unusual, but given the circumstances, it's your choice." Carlos and Maria exchanged a long look, years of understanding passing between them in a single moment. Finally, Carlos nodded. "Let him in." Robert Hawkins entered the room, looking nothing like the intimidating figure who had ordered Carlos's arrest just days ago. His shoulders were slumped, his face haggard with the weight of long-carried guilt. "Mr. Mendoza," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to begin. What happened to your cousin, to Miguel? It's haunted me every day for years. I was a coward. I ran. And then when I saw you playing in the plaza, looking so much like him, I panicked. I thought if I could make you go away, I could bury the past again. I was wrong, so terribly wrong." Carlos listened in stunned silence, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. Anger, grief, and an unexpected pang of empathy for the broken man before him. "I know I have no right to ask this," Hawkins continued, "but I'm begging for your forgiveness. I'll turn myself in, face whatever punishment comes. Just, please, I can't carry this burden any longer." The room fell silent, the weight of Hawkins' confession hanging heavy in the air. Carlos closed his eyes, his mind racing. Could he forgive this man who had caused so much pain, who had taken Miguel from them and then years later tried to silence Carlos's music? As if of its own accord, Carlos's hand reached for the guitar that had been brought to the conference room. His fingers found the strings, and he began to play. It was the song he had been composing in his cell, a melody of loss, of anger, but also of hope and the possibility of redemption. As the last notes faded away, Carlos opened his eyes. He looked at Maria, seeing in her gaze a reflection of his own tumultuous emotions. Then he turned to Hawkins. "I can't say I forgive you," Carlos said quietly. "Not yet. But I won't stand in the way of you doing the right thing, for Miguel, for justice, and maybe someday, for forgiveness." Hawkins nodded, tears streaming down his face. As he was led away by his lawyers, Carlos felt a strange mix of emotions, the weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future, but also a glimmer of something that felt like peace. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur. With Hawkins' confession and the overwhelming public support, the judge had little choice but to grant Carlos bail. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Outside, the roar of the crowd was deafening as Carlos emerged, hand in hand with Maria. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Carlos had eyes only for the sea of faces before him, people from all walks of life, united by his music and his story. As he stood on the courthouse steps, Carlos realized that this was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more music to play, more healing to be done. But for now, with Maria by his side and their baby on the way, he allowed himself to bask in this moment of victory. Raising the borrowed guitar, Carlos began to play. The crowd fell silent, then began to sway and sing along. In that moment, as his music once again filled the air of Chicago, Carlos knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, the power of forgiveness, justice, and the human spirit would light the way. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Millennium Park as Carlos stood before a sea of faces, his trusted guitar slung across his chest. The crowd, numbering in the thousands, buzzed with anticipation. It had been 2 weeks since his release, and Chicago had been eagerly awaiting this moment, Carlos's first public performance since his arrest. As Carlos surveyed the crowd, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. His eyes found Maria in the front row, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She gave him an encouraging smile, and he felt a surge of strength course through him. Taking a deep breath, Carlos stepped up to the microphone. "Buenas tardes, Chicago," he began, his voice carrying across the park. "Thank you all for being here today, for supporting me, for fighting for justice, for believing in the power of music." A cheer went up from the crowd, and Carlos felt his nerves begin to settle. This was what he was born to do: to play, to connect, to inspire. As his fingers found the strings, Carlos launched into a powerful rendition of "This Land Is Your Land," infusing the classic American folk song with Latin rhythms and his own soulful style. The crowd joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of unity and hope. From his vantage point on stage, Carlos could see the diversity of the audience: young and old, rich and poor, people of all races and backgrounds, brought together by his music and his story. He spotted some familiar faces: Officer Donovan, off-duty and swaying to the music; Emily, the young jail worker whose video had started it all, recording this moment on her phone; even Congressman Lewis, who had flown in specially for this event. As Carlos transitioned into his next song, a haunting ballad he had composed in jail, he noticed a figure standing at the back of the crowd. It was Robert Hawkins, looking both out of place and deeply moved. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Carlos gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement of the past, of the pain, and of the possibility of redemption. The concert flowed on, each song telling a part of Carlos's journey, from his early days as a street musician to his time in jail, from the loss of his cousin Miguel to the hope for his unborn child. The crowd hung on every note, every word, their energy feeding Carlos's performance. As the sun began to set, casting a fiery glow over the Chicago skyline, Carlos prepared for his final song. "This last one," he said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion, "is for everyone who's ever felt silenced, overlooked, or pushed to the margins. It's for those who keep singing, keep fighting, keep hoping, even when the world tells them to be quiet." The opening chords of "The Sound of Silence" rang out, but this was no simple cover. Carlos had reimagined the classic song, infusing it with Latin rhythms, jazz influences, and a defiant energy that transformed its meaning. As he sang, his voice soaring over the park, the message was clear: silence would no longer be accepted. The time for speaking out, for singing out, had come. As the last notes faded away, there was a moment of hushed awe before the park erupted in thunderous applause. Carlos felt tears prick at his eyes as he looked out over the cheering crowd. This wasn't just a concert, it was a movement, a statement, a new beginning. After the show, as Carlos made his way through the dispersing crowd, he was stopped by a young Latina girl, no more than 10 years old. She looked up at him with shining eyes, clutching a battered guitar of her own. "Mr. Carlos," she said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to make music that changes the world." Carlos knelt down to her level, gently taking her guitar and tuning it. "What's your name, pequeña?" "Maria," she replied, "like your wife." Carlos smiled, strumming a chord on the girl's guitar before handing it back. "Well, Maria, remember this: your voice matters, your music matters. Never let anyone tell you to be silent." As the girl beamed and scampered off to her waiting parents, Carlos felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Congressman Lewis standing there, a look of pride on his face. "That was quite a performance, son," Lewis said warmly. "You've started something important here. Are you ready to take this message to Washington?" Carlos glanced over at Maria, who had made her way to his side. She squeezed his hand and nodded encouragingly. "Yes, sir," Carlos replied, feeling a mix of determination and excitement. "I think it's time for Washington to hear our song." As they walked out of the park, the Chicago skyline glowing in the twilight, Carlos felt a profound sense of purpose. He had been given a second chance, not just for himself, but to be a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and those who would try to silence him again. But with Maria by his side, their child on the way, and the power of music as his weapon, Carlos was ready to face whatever came next. As they reached the street, the distant sound of a street musician playing floated on the evening breeze. Carlos smiled, remembering where his journey had begun. He may have left the street corners behind, but he would never forget the power of a single voice, a single song, to change the world. The battle for justice, for equality, for the right to be heard was far from over. But tonight, in the heart of Chicago, a new chord had been struck, and its resonance would be felt for years to come. The imposing facade of the United States Capitol building loomed before Carlos as he stood at the base of its grand steps. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the National Mall, and a crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of change in the air. It had been 3 months since his concert in Chicago, and now Carlos found himself in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before Congress on the issues of criminal justice reform and the importance of arts in community development. As he adjusted his tie, a gift from Congressman Lewis, Carlos felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was no longer just Carlos Mendoza, the street musician from Chicago. He had become a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, and the eyes of the nation were upon him. Maria, now in her 8th month of pregnancy, squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You've got this, mi amor," she whispered, her eyes shining with pride and love. Carlos nodded, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. As they climbed the steps, he couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought him here. From the streets of Chicago to a jail cell, and now to the halls of power in Washington, it seemed almost too incredible to be real. Inside the hearing room, Carlos found himself facing a panel of stern-faced lawmakers. Cameras flashed, and he could feel the buzz of anticipation in the air. As he was sworn in, Carlos closed his eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer for strength and guidance. "Mr. Mendoza," the committee chairman began, "please share your story with us." And so, Carlos spoke. He told of his life as a street musician, of the joy and connection his music brought to people from all walks of life. He spoke of his unjust arrest, of the systemic issues that led to such incidents, and of the power of art to bridge divides and heal communities. As he spoke, Carlos could see the faces of the lawmakers softening, their skepticism giving way to genuine interest. He shared stories of fellow inmates he'd met, of the broken lives and lost potential he'd witnessed. And he spoke of music, how it had been his lifeline, his voice, and ultimately his path to redemption and purpose. When he finished his prepared statement, there was a moment of profound silence in the room. Then, unexpectedly, one of the senators asked, "Mr. Mendoza, would you honor us with a song?" Carlos hesitated, looking to the chairman for permission. With a nod of approval, he reached for his guitar, which had been sitting beside him throughout the hearing. As his fingers found the strings, Carlos closed his eyes, letting the music flow through him. He played a new composition, one he had been working on specifically for this moment. It was a song of hope and unity, of the American dream and the struggles to achieve it. As he sang, his voice filling the chamber, Carlos poured every ounce of his experience, his pain, and his hope into the music. When the last note faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the most hardened politicians seemed moved, a few discreetly wiping away tears. As the hearing concluded, Carlos felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had said his piece, had played his song. Now, it was up to those in power to listen and act. Outside the Capitol, a crowd had gathered, supporters, activists, and fellow musicians who had come to stand with Carlos. As he emerged into the sunlight, a cheer went up. Carlos raised his guitar in acknowledgement, a gesture of solidarity and hope. Reporters swarmed around him, shouting questions, but before Carlos could respond, he noticed a commotion in the crowd. A group of young street performers, clearly inspired by his story, had set up impromptu on the sidewalk and begun to play. In that moment, Carlos made a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. Instead of addressing the press, he made his way through the crowd to the young musicians. With a smile, he joined their circle, adding his guitar to their melody. As the impromptu concert grew, drawing in more performers and spectators, Carlos realized that this connection, this sharing of music and spirit, was his true calling. He had been given a platform, yes, but his real power lay in inspiring others to raise their voices, to share their stories through art. Maria watched from the steps, her hand resting on her belly, feeling their child kick in response to the music. She saw in Carlos's eyes a fire, a determination that told her their journey was far from over. As the sun began to set over the Capitol dome, casting a golden glow over the scene, Carlos knew that while he had sacrificed his anonymity and simple life, he had gained something far more precious, the ability to effect real change, to inspire a movement that was larger than himself. The music swelled, voices joining in harmony, a tapestry of sound that seemed to echo the very spirit of democracy and hope. And in the heart of Washington, D.C., surrounded by the symbols of power and history, a new song was being written, a song of the people, by the people, for the people. Carlos Mendoza, the street musician from Chicago, had come to Washington to testify. But he would leave as something more, a catalyst, a spark that would ignite a cultural revolution. As he played on, surrounded by a growing circle of musicians and supporters, Carlos knew that this was just the beginning. The true work, of healing, of reforming, of uniting, lay ahead. But with music as his guide and the voice of the people as his strength, Carlos was ready to face whatever challenges came next. For in the end he realized the most powerful change doesn't come from the top down, but from the ground up. One song, one voice, one heart at a time.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.